And welcome to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's live stream broadcast of COVID-19 in a World with Pandemics, featuring former U.S. Ambassador to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Honorable William Garvelink. I'm Michael Van Dennen. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. And on behalf of my colleagues, Erica Kubik and Emily Smith, and the Board of Directors of the Council, welcome you to this conversation, timely conversation. And we're grateful also for our partners at the Calvin Academy for Lifelong Learning, CALL, and the fine program manager of CALL, Sonia DeYoung. Thanks for your assistance. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope you will stay safe and you will show grace to those in your community. Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the help of 50 local businesses, 11 colleges and universities, and many community partners. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe, you first need to know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. We're pleased to have Ambassador Garvelink with us, and we're grateful to him for his flexibility to engage us in this format. Some of you may remember that he was our guest about a year and a half ago when we invited him to speak on the topic Major Global Trends. And in that presentation, Ambassador Garvelink named his top 3 global challenges. Number 3 was failed states, number 2 was global corruption, and number 1 was pandemics. Yep, he was quite prophetic in that. We thought it would be wise to have Ambassador Garvelink come back with us to give his observations about COVID-19 and what national and international leaders ought to be projecting and thinking as we prepare for a world with pandemics. And yes, he believes there will be more on the way. Bill Garvelink was raised in Holland, Michigan, and he graduated from Holland Christian and from Calvin College. He earned a master's degree from the University of Minnesota. And after a short time on Capitol Hill as a congressional assistant, Ambassador Garvelink joined USAID, where he served with distinction for 3 decades before his appointment as the U.S. Ambassador to the Democratic Republic of the Congo on behalf of President George W. Bush. His many assignments at USAID include 11 years as the Office of Foreign Disaster Service, OFDA, first as Assistant Director for Response, and then as Deputy Director. While in OFDA, he directed relief operations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Near East, Europe, and the former Soviet Union. He also led many disaster response teams, or DARTs, in parts of Albania, Armenia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Iraq, Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, and Iran. He chaired the USAID's task force for the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the task force for the Pakistani earthquake, and the Lebanese task force. Ambassador Garvelink has received 6 performance awards, 2 meritorious honor awards, a superior honor award, and a senior foreign service presidential meritorious service for his work in the U.S. Department of State. Calvin College bestowed on Ambassador Garvelink the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2007. After Ambassador Garvelink's presentation today, there will be ample time for questions, and you may type them into the YouTube comments section, or you can text them to 616-308-6560. Please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. His presentation today is titled COVID-19 and a Future with Pandemics. We welcome Ambassador Bill Garvelink. Bill, thanks for joining us. Hope you and your family are safe.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and especially you, Michael, and Erica Kubik and Emily Smith for putting this all together and making it work. What I would like to do today is let me run through kind of the things I would like to cover. First of all, I'd like to talk about some global trends that are increasing the rise or the likelihood of pandemic diseases. I would review quickly the characteristics of COVID-19 and then highlight a few steps that we can take to control the virus in the United States. I would also like to make a few comments about what's going on in the United States today and what's going on in the world related to COVID-19. And finally, make a few comments or suggestions of what we need to do as we have a future ahead of us that's going to have more pandemics in them. So there are several global trends that have increased the likelihood of pandemics in the world today. And I'd like to just run through 5 of them and very briefly. The first is population growth. The world's population is 7.6 billion right now, and by 2050, it'll be 10 billion. And to meet the food requirements of this growing population, global food production has to increase by more than 50%. To do that, additional lands, agricultural lands, have to be brought under cultivation, and that's going to increase the contact between humans and wildlife. And it's going to happen worldwide. Urbanization is happening faster now in the world than it's ever happened in history. 55% of the world's population lives in cities, and by 2050, that will be 70%. To accommodate this growth, cities and nearby urban suburbs have to expand into fields and forest areas surrounding their location. And that, again, will be encroaching on wildlife habitats. One of the more powerful forces or trends in the world today is climate change. And we can see from the serious events happening in the United States and around the world that because of climate change, people are moving either for economic reasons or just better living conditions to different parts of the world. Well, that's true not just for people, but for animals like rats, bats, mosquitoes. These sort of things are moving toward more hospitable environments. And those are the same ones where people are moving to. So again, we're going to increase the contact between humans and animals. And as we all know, the world continues to globalize at a very fast rate, especially when it comes to travel. We can reach any place in the planet in less than 24 hours. So whatever happens, even in the most remote area of the world, will affect us here in the United States. For example, a baby catches Ebola in the forest in Guinea, West Africa, and Ebola appears in Texas. COVID-19 comes to life in Wuhan, China, and it appears soon after in Seattle. The last global trend I'd like to mention is affecting us directly today, and is not talked about a whole lot, and that's the international trade in wildlife. This trade is enormous and mostly illegal. The illegal trade is valued at $10 to $20 billion a year, and illegal wildlife trade is the 4th most profitable global crime after drugs, human trafficking, and arms sales. The folks behind most of the international trafficking in animals are terrorist groups, international criminal syndicates, and drug cartels. The companion to this international trade in wildlife are wet markets. And this is where, of course, the animals are sold. And in these markets, some animals are sold for pets, others are butchered for food, and others are killed to make potions or traditional diseases. If you've ever seen one of these markets, it's quite astounding. Animals are displayed in wire cages, and they're piled 5, 6, 7 high on top of each other. The animals are terrified, and the animals on the top urinate or bleed or salivate or onto the the animals below them. And this is a perfect set of conditions where pathogens can run from one animal to the next and then to the people who buy the animals. 70% of the infectious diseases that have appeared in the last 2 decades are zoonotic. That means they come from animals and are transmitted to humans. So these 5 global trends are mutually reinforcing and promoting the increased contact between humans and animals and increase the likelihood of serious infectious diseases that turn into pandemics like COVID-19. What I would like to do now is just mention the characteristics of COVID-19. I'm sure most people are aware of them, but this is a respiratory virus and it transmits from one person to another with respiratory droplets. That's talking, coughing, sneezing, and that sort of thing. A high percentage of the folks who have been infected with the coronavirus are asymptomatic. So while they don't show any signs of the disease, they can still transmit the diseases to other people. The incubation period for this, for COVID-19 is 14 days. And I think it's important to remember, and despite what some people have said, COVID-19 is far more lethal than the seasonal flu that we're all familiar with. In fact, the experts say it's more lethal than the 1918 Spanish flu, which killed 700,000 Americans and 50 to 100 million people worldwide. So this disease, this infection has to be taken very seriously. And as we know, there's no cure for it. So one of the questions is, how do we control the spread of this virus in the United States? And the folks who specialize in these sorts of diseases have laid it out quite clearly, and it's not complicated, at least in its explaining. It gets complicated when you have to implement it. But in the first instance, controlling COVID-19 depends on the behavior of each individual American. It's washing your hands, it's wearing a mask, and it's physical distancing. A lot of people use social distancing, but that's a vague term in my mind. It's physical. You gotta be at least 6 feet or more away from other people. At the same time, as these very basic things are underway, what is required is an enormous amount of testing to identify who has the virus and to isolate these people quickly from the rest of the population. And once they're isolated, we can get their history of who they've been in contact with for the past 2 weeks. And then contact tracers contact all of the people that the infected person has had contact with, and they go over the nature of the contact, and if appropriate, testing is provided to those people too. And then the sequence repeats itself: testing, isolation, and contact tracing. And this is basically how you get a handle on the population, the infected population in the United States. What this assumes, however, is there is an abundance of testing kits, medical staff, and contact tracers, which the United States needs about 300,000 of to do the job properly, and hospitals that are properly equipped for the isolation and treatment of the victims. And that has, as we all know, that has been a bit of a problem in the United States. The major concern going on right now is, how do we reopen the economy and get the government and the population going again, employed again? The experts in this area, again, have laid this system out. Again, it's not too complicated in the telling. There aren't that many steps to it. First of all, there are 4 criteria that have to be met before it's safe to open up, in our case, a state. And the first is 14 days of continuous declining cases of COVID-19. There has to be enough testing to test everyone with COVID who has symptoms or COVID-like symptoms. And there has to be enough public health officers who can do contact tracing of each new case. And finally, there has to be enough properly equipped hospitals to care for those who are isolated and provide treatment. And this includes those with mild cases. I think we can see from Tom Hanks and Chris Cuomo, isolating by themselves at home didn't work. Their wives were infected shortly after they were. So the best way to deal with even mild cases, to isolate them, not necessarily in a hospital, but in some building or institution which is managed by medical folks. Anyway, once those criteria are met, states can safely begin opening their economy. Now, when you start easing restrictions, this still assumes that there will be widespread testing, isolating, contact tracing, and treatment, and that these have to go on all the time so that the public health people can identify any upsurge in infections and isolate those people quickly before the virus spirals out of control. The other element that's really important in reopening the economy is building public confidence in the plan to do so. Governors have to lay this out, be very transparent, talk about what their priorities are, what parts of the economy are going to be open first and why. And they should be very honest about the difficulties of doing that. And if it doesn't work, what will happen and what will they have to do? That should be laid out very clearly. If we don't build public confidence in these plans, it's very unlikely that most of the people will actually follow them in any consistent way. So that in a short statement, that's what has to be done to contain the COVID virus in the United States. And this is how the steps you would go through to go from that to controlling it and opening the economy. What I would like to do for just a couple minutes is talk about what's going on in the United States right now, and then a few comments about what's going on in the world related to COVID-19. No state has met the 4 criteria, and no state can open up safely. However, most governors are beginning to do this in piecemeal fashion based on their own best judgments. And it seems like most governors are opening up the states in rural areas that have been less affected at this point, and maybe in some distant suburbs. And the experts on this, again, say opening part of a state as opposed to the whole state is a recipe for disaster. And let me explain exactly why I say that. The staggered approach to opening a state ignores basic human nature. If you open the state by portions and you focus initially on the rural areas and some rural suburbs and open up restaurants and some businesses there, this makes it very hard to enforce the regulations that are still in place in urban centers in that state. And what will inevitably happen, and always does in past cases, is urban dwellers will decide they want to go out for dinner and go visit the restaurants and might do a little shopping in the business that are open in the rural areas. And with them comes the coronavirus. And these areas have not been as affected as the urban areas. They don't have the testing, isolating, contact tracing, and treatment capacities that they need. And no one will be on hand to identify an uptick in the coronavirus in time to stop the outbreak that's happening at the time in that area. So what we're going to see, I suspect, is COVID-19 bouncing around the US, creating hotspots and causing, excuse me, unnecessary deaths and economic hardship. It strikes me that there's a lot of magical thinking going on around the United States right now, that the pandemic we've seen the worst of it and it's winding down. One of the experts in this from the University of Minnesota said the best way to think of this is we're in the second inning of a 9-inning game. We are not anywhere near the mid part or end of this virus. Others say, well, it's not really that lethal, or some others say for some reason it will disappear. None of these things are true. And opening the states prematurely will just cause excessive deaths and prolong the economic hardship that we're in right now. And we could see returning to lockdowns and that sort of thing. Just a quick comment or two on the international side of things. COVID-19 is an international worldwide pandemic. 210 countries and territories have reported cases of COVID-19. Excuse me. The United States will not be safe until COVID-19 is brought under control in all of these countries. So what is essential is that the countries of the world come together to address the COVID-19 pandemic together. What is not helpful is the sniping that goes back and forth between the US and China, which are the two largest economies in the world. The developed countries have to get behind the United Nations and the World Health Organization, which, contrary to a lot of folks, is a very effective organization, and help them help poor countries tackle the coronavirus in their own country. Many of the low and middle income countries simply don't have the resources or the expertise to do this right now on their own, so they need help. And if we choose not to do that, what is likely to happen is the Latin America, Africa, and Asia is a little bit behind the United States and Europe and China in getting the disease. It's starting to build very quickly in all of these areas. You have Peru and Ecuador, in Brazil, in South America, and 6 or 7 different countries in Africa and Asia. Right now, it's blooming. What will happen is sometime at the end of this year or next year, it will rebound. The disease will end up coming back to the United States from these poorer countries. So it's in our interest to help them deal with this as quickly as possible. Now, just a couple of final comments, and I really look forward to a discussion. We're going to see more pandemics in our future, not once every 100 years, but much more often than that. So we've got to figure out how to prepare for these things. And I have a couple of suggestions I'd like to throw out for you to think about. First is we've got to redefine how we see national security. It's not simply or just wars with other countries or terrorist groups. It's got to be viewed much more broadly, that include infectious diseases, and their ultimate is pandemic diseases. And we've got to be prepared to deal with these things. So what we need is a national plan, and that lays out exactly how the United States is going to deal with a pandemic disease that they're facing, and will lay out the steps for dealing with it. It'll talk about which United States agency is in charge of this, and will work with the states to deal with the pandemic. It should also lay out what Congress should do to provide financial assistance to the most affected parts of of our society. Also, we should all engage with the United Nations right now and the World Health Organization to help the various countries build their public health systems so that in the future, they can contain the pandemic themselves in their own country. This is really in the US interest. It will save lives, and it'll be far cheaper than going through what we see right now. And finally, the United States and the other wealthy countries of the world should link up with the United Nations and develop the vaccine for COVID-19 together. It's got to be developed, and then it's got to be sent to all countries in the world so they can use it. And it would be wise to do that together and not individually. And certainly in the future, we should lay out a plan that explains exactly how we're going to work with the rest of the world and develop the vaccines that we may need for future pandemics, and then a plan for distributing those vaccines worldwide. Pandemic responses are not hopeless. We know exactly what we have to do to protect the United States. And we also know how the international community must work together to ensure worldwide readiness for the next pandemic. All we need is the political will to do it. And I look forward to your questions or comments.
Thank you, Bill. Fascinating, fascinating opening to this conversation about COVID-19 and pandemics. Thank you for getting us thinking about a lot of issues. And I wonder what makes COVID-19 so unique. You were on the front lines at the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You saw Ebola and our response to that, and that horrible disease, which is still active.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes COVID-19 different than that, and both less concerning and more concerning?
Well, it's a two-edged sword a bit with if you compare COVID-19, say, to Ebola, or you can go back a few years and you have MERS and SARS and these various, I guess they would be called epidemics because they didn't become worldwide, they stayed regional. Those diseases and Ebola were particularly lethal. The mortality rate for Ebola, for example, ranges between 50 and 60%. On the good side, with COVID-19, it's not so lethal. So it exists for a very long time, and it infects a lot more people. So it's a really mixed blessing. People live longer, they don't die right away, but they're infecting large populations. So I think that's part of the reason that why it spreads so fast. And, you know, it's not visible to something like 70% of the people who are infected with COVID-19 don't exhibit any symptoms until they're the very last and they get really sick. So it's in one sense a milder, more disease than Ebola, for example, but it will involve far more people than a deadly one like Ebola will. I don't know if that's helpful. It's just that it's different.
Bill, public confidence, you said, is key. So how do you get a degree? How did you get a degree of public confidence in the DRC when you were working on Ebola? It seems like public confidence is wavering, not just in our country, but in other countries too. It's a tough one to manage for leaders, whether you're presidents or leaders of a country or whether you're a governor. How did public confidence get raised during the Ebola crisis?
Well, I think you raise a good point. I think there's been a gap here in the United States. If we use Ebola as an example, what we did and what's still being done is we had community organizers who would actually go into the communities, sit down with village elders, religious leaders, their politicians, and explain exactly what the disease is and why it has to be treated the way it has to be treated, and why people have to be isolated, and why they have to be buried very quickly without the normal traditions that go along with burials in the African country. And if you can get to people and explain that to them and engage them and say, what are your problems? And they'll say, we don't like this or that. So, okay, we'll figure out how to adjust this a little bit, so it's more accommodating to your concerns. I think this is a much bigger country, obviously, and a lot more people, but when edicts come down from the White House that are confused, they're not always consistent, and governors are doing things differently from other governors, and mayors are saying, no, we're not going to do that. My city is going to follow this approach as opposed to what the governor wants. it's very confusing because this is a scary disease and people would like to know exactly what this all means and their place in it. And I think we have not done a great job of getting down to, community levels below big city levels and sitting with folks and say, look, here's what's going on and we need your help. And I think that if it's possible in the United States, as big as it is and as varied as it is, that is a very important element in this whole process that is pretty much absent.
Bill, a question from a listener today. What's your best advice for trying to get those who don't believe in physical distancing, face masks and the like to cooperate? Is there a magic formula or some basic language that you would use if you're talking to someone who doesn't think it's all necessary?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. And certainly around Falls Church here where I am, we see that. And you want to grab somebody and, shake him. But I think it goes back to there's not been good explanations of exactly why you have to do this and what will happen if you don't. Because these folks are the ones who say, well, this isn't really that contagious. It's almost over with. I can get on with it and I'm not going to catch anything. Surprise, they will. And I think it has a lot to do with local officials having town hall meetings. I don't know what all you do. You're always going to have some who no matter what you do are not going to pay attention. But I think it comes to really explaining why it seems goofy you have to wear this mask. We haven't done that before in the same way in the United States. And so why is this really necessary? And I think with some senior officials who don't bother with them, that complicates the situation.
Thank you. You can ask questions by using the YouTube chat column. You can type them right in there. And you can also call 616-308-6560. And we will work on getting those questions to Ambassador Garvelink. What damage do you think, there's been some back and forth between US and China, but what do you think China's conduct at the beginning of this pandemic has caused? I mean, certainly we're concerned about how it came out and how they responded to it or didn't. The famous story about the doctor who tried to alert people in Wuhan that there was this pandemic, there was this new disease. He was muted and wound up dying of COVID-19. Talk a little bit about China's handling of this right at the beginning.
Well, I think there are some issues with what China has done. I think they tried to downplay this. I think they didn't. I mean, they're fairly sophisticated. I mean, very sophisticated in the design of medicines and medical care. And our people work very closely with the Chinese. But I think there are political implications with this that they did not want this to get out in any big way. And there's been a lot of criticism of the World Health Organization for being a partner in this. And I think it's important to understand how the United Nations operates. One of the shortcomings of the World Health Organization is the international body has not given them authority to act on their own. So like every UN agency, when they're going to issue a document, they got to go to the host country and they have to sign off on it. And if the Chinese don't sign off on it, they can't issue it. So it gets modified by the Chinese and you figure, well, this is better than nothing. The United Nations as a whole has got to authorize the World Health Organization, as they have with some other agencies, to go ahead and issue the reports on their own, regardless of the political interests of the country they're in. So that contributes to it too. And I think the Chinese underestimated how contagious this was going to be. And so, yeah, they underplayed it a bit. I'm not sure that had any dramatic effect on where it went after China. It was just probably not a great idea. It was a mistake early on that's hard to work your way out of after you do it.
Bill, a comment from a listener here. Many cities around the world are working to contain cities many countries around the world are working to contain cities within their current urban footprints. Probably an uphill battle. You mentioned the encroachment of cities on natural or rural parts or forests, whatever. And so the human animal contact becomes more likely. Is there any global effort on this? Is anybody paying attention to this? Are there some countries doing this well? Are there some blueprints or models for us?
For expanding the cities.
For keeping cities in a context where we can try to mitigate this increasing human animal contact.
It's really hard to do. And if you look at some of the major cities around the world, they're built around slums, garbage heaps, all these sorts of things. And it's just, even if it's not a forest, there's a wonderful environment for critters to exist and thrive. I would suggest that may not be possible to do given the speed of urbanization, because where it's going so fast. Certainly I know Africa better than other places. There's no urban planning. So there's no jobs, there's no places to live. So you live wherever you can on the outskirts of the city. So it's and it expands without, without any planning to it. And the other approach, and I think the world organizations should pay attention to this, and they do. And in fact, there's quite a bit of attention now being focused on it. It's called One Health. And that's studying now, and it's the universities are very active in this, the relationship between animal health and human health. And if we focus more on that, we can have an impact on cities that are expanding into wildlife habitats. For example, it's my understanding that medical students at Harvard who are becoming doctors have to spend a certain amount of time with veterinarians to understand the animal side of things. So the animals and humans were kind of treated as completely separate. Well, they're not. They're dependent on each other, and as we talked about, getting more and more related to each other. So I think we have to look at them not individually, but together. And I know Texas A&M, the University of Minnesota, others are very much engaged in this One Health approach. That may offer some solutions for the way for cities to expand, but not expand the diseases that they get from linking up with or being closer to animals.
So there is some research going on in the US about animal health, animal viruses, trying to identify them. You mentioned fruit bats are maybe the world king of carrying around diseases with them, but you can't just eliminate all fruit bats because that upsets the nature chain in other areas, right?
Yeah, fruit bats are like bees; they pollinate different crops and that sort of thing. So you don't want to get rid of them, but they get blamed for just about everything, and that's the wrong solution. It's figuring out how to either get rid of the virus in the fruit bat, or how to treat the viruses that they may transmit a different. Because what normally happens is the fruit bat will contact wildlife animals, have contact with them, and they're usually the weakest animal. And so when that animal then infected by the fruit bat tries to escape in Africa from hunters, they're the slowest one, they're the last one in the line. So the hunters shoot the weakest animal, and then they butcher it for bushmeat. And that's a very nifty way to transfer the disease from the bat to somebody eating bushmeat.
Bill, can you talk more about the fundamentals of communicating future plans as we in opening cities, opening economies, especially with respect to potential future waves of the virus? You mentioned that was critical. You were somewhat critical of doing this piecemeal, that you mentioned that that's not a recipe for a smooth transition, but what should be in the fundamental of any plan that a governor or anybody else starts talking about? Okay, we're going to open up our economy. What should they be communicating?
Well, I think the first thing that should be foremost in the governor's, his or her mind, is there's got to be adequate staffing, testing equipment to test everybody who may have COVID-like symptoms. Because you can open up the process if you test everybody and identify those very quickly who have been infected and isolate them. Then you can, and you do that in a very robust way. Then as you begin to slowly open up businesses like they're talking about now, well, not a lot of people, but this amount of people, this sort of thing, you can do that. But if you don't have all the testing equipment, the experts say in the United States, we have to be able to do 350,000 tests a day. We aren't anywhere near that. And like we need 300,000 contact tracers to be effective around the United States. If those things are in place and the masks are there and the testing kits are reliable, which is another issue that's been a bit of a problem. And you can do that, and you can rest assured that the public health people are going to identify things quickly if there's an upsurge. Then you can begin to open places up. And you can control meatpacking plants as you watch things develop. But without that, by the time you notice, probably hundreds of people have been infected one way or another. And so you've got to really be on your toes for a long time with this. I hate to keep harping on this, but it's testing, isolating, contact tracing, and treating. Those things are fundamental. And if we can do that, then you can start to open up the economy and other sorts of things in a very, it still has to be a very careful, methodical way, but you can do it in safety, as opposed to going like most people are doing right now. Governors, they're flying blind. They're going to open this up and they think this will probably work. Well, it won't. That's just the nature of a pandemic. But if you have the other things to go with it, you have a crack at it.
Hey, Bill, just a shout out from your alma mater, just a comment from a YouTube listener that Calvin University's biology department is using One Health in their curriculum. So you'll be happy to know that your alma mater is.
That's perfect. I'm very proud of those guys then.
Another question here. Do you see the private sector having a place in this process of testing and contact tracing? We've been, CDC's taken some criticism, other government agencies taking criticism that they haven't done things quickly and well enough. What about the outbreaks in the meatpacking industry and how businesses can be responsible? So what should the private sector, businesses and companies, can they play some role in helping this happen well?
Yeah, I think they can do exactly what we've been talking about. They've got to test their people and look for, the COVID cases and isolate them quickly. Because watching this on television, they say, well, okay, now we've set up, you wear masks and all that sort of stuff. You have screens between each other. And I wonder, well, does that care go to the elevators, the restrooms, the stairwells where the banisters are there? Does it go to, that all has to be part of this process. So it's very complicated to ensure the safety of your folks. But I don't see any other way to do it. And the private sector should certainly be taking care of its own people that way as well, I would think.
So each business is unique, of course. So every business should be planning right now, should be thinking about how they handle this in their own office spaces with their employees, with their clients. And it's going to be different from a restaurant than a law firm, than a bank, whatever. Everybody's got a unique sort of business. So they have to think through this very carefully.
Yeah. And I would assume they should talk it over with their mayors or governors. And, one of the problems is I don't think the governors have enough resources to manage all of this. I mean, that's another thing with having, being really safe about it. They need more resources from the federal government to manage their states. since the federal government chose not to do this, it's incumbent upon them to provide the resources to the states so they can actually safely manage their own state. And I don't think that's been done either.
A question from a listener: how can the world address this global wet market issue? And is they in trade and wildlife? Is there any global effort on this? Is this? You mentioned that a lot of people doing it are this is drug cartels. These are people that are not good people. They're not going to obey global laws or their own national laws. Is there any global effort or national effort to address this? Because if it doesn't happen, this is a recipe for disaster.
Right. Well, I think the World Wildlife Fund is very engaged in this. And about 2 weeks ago, the president of Australia came out and said, we've got to ban all wet markets around the world. And I think that's the UN has got to take this on as well and help coordinate with the various countries of the world to, in fact, ban these wet markets. There is some legal trade if you want an exotic pet, that there are legal means to do all of that. But the bushmeat side and some of these potions and all of that, that's all superstition. And, it doesn't make any sense. Well, I guess it does to some people. But I think if the major countries in the world would get together and actually do something, they could get rid of a large portion of these wet markets, because every country has them. Even the United States, you can find them. And they're maybe a little more humane than some of the ones in Africa and Asia, but they're around every place. And it would be worth putting an end to these things, because it's a great way to transmit bacteria, viruses from one animal to another. And like I said, whoever buys that animal is probably buying a whole bunch of viruses.
From a viewer in Alaska, we're glad that there's somebody watching us today from Alaska. If a person has the coronavirus but is asymptomatic and therefore doesn't realize that they have it, how long are they contagious? You mentioned something about 14 days. Is that demonstratable?
Yeah,
that's the amount of time.
That's the incubation period. And if you don't show symptoms after 14 days, I'm no medical guy, so don't take this too seriously. But the trick is, if you think you have it, go be tested. And they can tell you whether you do or don't. And then after 14 days with no symptoms, it should be easing up at that point, because that's what they normally quarantine people for, is 14 days.
And every virus like this has a different incubation period, right? Ebola had a different amount of days than COVID-19.
Yeah, Ebola was 21 days. So when you wanted to be able to say an area no longer has Ebola, they double that. It has to be 42 days without seeing an infection. So with COVID, it would be 28 days. Then you can say, well, we're done with it.
Question from a listener. The U.S. emphasizes free enterprise to develop cures and that the government shouldn't coordinate the actions, but does that conflict with the international cooperation you were talking about, needed to develop and distribute vaccines? This is a listener question.
I don't think so. And again, I may be wrong. This is not my area of expertise, but in the development of other vaccines, like the ones that have been developed for Ebola, it's involved several countries in different countries, and they're working under their own laws, but working together and sharing information so that you can faster make the development of a vaccine faster, because it's a slow process. I've heard that the fastest that has been approved so far is 4 years. So to move this faster, you need a lot more people involved. The other issue that will come up, and I've heard experts talk about, is even if you get the vaccine, there's no way in the world you can produce enough of it to really take control of this thing worldwide. You may be able to help the United States, but not worldwide. So you got to get everybody involved in this, working together. And I don't think I think it should be able to work with various companies. And I think in general, most of these big pharmaceutical companies have offices and production facilities in Europe or China, and they're already international. And so build on that. But this competition, there was an article, it was very interesting. It said, what if the Europeans or the Chinese developed the vaccine first? This America first thing, they may say, well, you get it last. You know, then they get to determine who gets it. If you do it together, everybody gets it. And so there are advantages to breaking down barriers and saying, in this case, at least, let's get together on it.
Bill, from a listener, what might be the worst case scenario if the U.S. population doesn't follow the physical distancing and the like, you know? And there is, you know, we've in this country, there's a economy versus, you know, the health thing. Put it in, it's all one or all the other. Is it that way? And what are the costs of not doing this well?
Well, I think if it really goes to the worst case, we're going back to lockdowns again for everybody, and then starting from square one again and moving forward. There's an interesting thing you can look up that, again, not being an expert on this, I shouldn't even be talking about it, but there's herd immunities. And that's the way you may finally end the virus. And that means about 80% of the Americans have to get COVID-19. So there's no place to transfer to for the virus, no other place to go. There's very few places they can infect anybody else, but that will involve enormous numbers of people who've died. And so, you know, that's not the way you want to solve this problem. You want a vaccine, and you want to be very careful about, again, your testing and isolating and tracing. But we're going to see flare-ups all the time at different places. And if we don't have the right things in place, we'll always be behind the 8 ball, and we'll never catch up with this thing. And that could go on for a long time. You know, some folks say this thing is around for a couple more years. And it's, you know, if we do the right thing, it can be around, and we have to be very careful with it, but we can start to get back to normal. If we don't do it right, then we are in for a really tough few years economically and medically.
One thing we've been hearing, Bill, is that, you know, viruses can mutate, right? And
Right.
that further adds another layer of scary fun to this. And there's been some questions about little children now getting a fever, some disease that they think might be connected to COVID-19, but they're not sure. In your experience with Ebola and other things, how does this, how do people keep track of this mutation aspect? And is that a factor with COVID-19?
Well, I haven't heard that there's been any major mutations yet in COVID-19. You know, I'm sure the scientists are very focused on that and looking for indications of you know, modifications or changes. I know with Ebola that happened quite often. I remember at one point I was in the Congo, and there was a medical team in the jungle, and they're still there. They're military/university specialists looking at diseases for the military, and they would come and see me when they're leaving and say, "Here's what we've been up to in the jungle, in case you want to know." And I mentioned I was there, I think, during 2 small Ebola outbreaks. And I mentioned this, and they said, well, these things mutate all the time. You don't even want to know what goes on. So that is a common feature that you have to take into consideration, but I have not heard much about that so far with COVID-19.
Well, you mentioned that near the end of your remarks, you talked about how do we prepare? You talked about redefining national security. It's not just about war, it's also about infectious diseases, these kinds of things. You talked about engaging the UN and the WHO to build a world public health system, because we can do everything we want. But as we saw with COVID-19, if it comes from some other country here, it winds up on our doorstep anyway.
Yep.
And then thirdly, you talked about the US and other companies developing vaccines and making it available and doing it together. I just wonder if a fourth one, you alluded to it a couple times, is about animal research. You talked about Texas A&M doing this, University of Minnesota, maybe others, taking animal research more seriously, because it's 70% of these kinds of viruses are zoonotic. They're coming from animals. It seems that it would do us well to know a lot more about this in animals.
Oh yeah, I think it would be in our interest, I guess, well, we should start it right away, but looking at how the military prepares for what it does. It stockpiles the right stuff. Like that group I mentioned out in the Congo, they were looking at diseases for the way they would affect soldiers. That was their main thing, was monkeypox in the Congo at that point. But we should do exactly the same thing on using CDC and universities, looking at what kind of diseases will likely affect the population, and where do they come from. A lot of them come from animals, and start focusing on that. And my sense is it goes on in not necessarily in a disjointed way, but not in a way led by the United States government itself, that this is an interest of the United States. And we've got to focus on this, and we have to put resources toward it. It's not cheap, but it's an awful lot cheaper than what we're going through right now in terms of the impact on the economy. So it'd be worth having a unit somewhere, either in the Centers for Disease Control, or, well, we used to have one in the White House, but that was disbanded, that focuses on this and has the steps that they want to follow to take into consideration diseases and these sort of things, stockpiling the right stuff, research that has to be done for this purpose, and and it funded. There's an outfit in the military called DARPA that does all kinds of weird research. That's where the internet first came from. And they do research of all kinds that have a national security focus. Well, an outfit like that should or be created to do the health side of things. And, we're going to have to do it sooner or later. We might as well get on with it.
Bill, you ended your remarks by saying, this is not hopeless. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of pain and worry, and all of us, this whole idea of being in quarantine is so foreign to most of us in the United States, and there's a lot of anxiety about it. But it's not hopeless. I mean, you've seen it work. You've been around the world dealing with Ebola and other pandemics. So, what kind of give us a pep talk, give us some hope that we can do this thing, that we can get over it, and taking the right steps.
Yeah.
We're not destined to a life in quarantine for good.
No, and I think we sort of missed the boat initially with not being as prepared as we should have been, and not reacting in the right way, in January, February, and March. Okay, now let's put that behind us and get our act together and do the testing and isolating and all of this. We've got a lot of smart people around and dedicated people. We can do this. And once we get that in place, then it won't be long before we can start opening up. It may still be a process, but we can get people back to work. I mean, if you get all these contact tracers, that's 300,000 new jobs for people to do that. And so that's, we just have to focus, and wear the mask, physical distancing, wash your hands, and have the government do the other stuff. Then we can get moving again. So we know what to do. And that's to me, the part that drives me the most nuts. We know what to do, and we just aren't doing it. And if we did, we'd be in a very different place right now than we are. So, okay, we've got a few months that weren't as productive as they should have been. Let's do it now and focus and get the resources to the states that need it, do the testing and all this stuff, do the distancing, and we can start to open up.
Hey, Bill, last question. There is a lot of debate on what's the government role here, what's the state role. You've touched on that a couple times because it is a delicate balance. I mean, how this plays out in Wyoming is different than how this is playing out in New York State, and that's where you have some of the conflict a little bit too. You know, you've got places that aren't very affected by this. In Michigan, I have a friend of mine who likes to call Michigan 3 different states. There's Eastern Michigan with Detroit and Lansing. There's Western Michigan, where we are in Grand Rapids and along the Lake Michigan Lakeshore. And there's the Upper Peninsula. And this virus has affected all 3 differently. So, how does all this work? The coordination between the federal government and what their role should be, the states and the governors and local officials, which you've mentioned them quite often, the mayors and local county officials. How does that all connect to get this right?
Well, I can give you my 2 cents worth. I don't really know. But it would seem to me is that you have a national plan put together by the federal government, and it's broad. It focuses on the stockpiles, the techniques, how you define what's safe to open. And then the states develop their plans, and it feeds up into the national plan. And it's got to be consistent with the national plan so that everybody knows. And then you can, from the governor's plan, city mayors can get involved in designing the state plan with the governor. So everybody knows what the process is. And then when you deviate from it, and you better have a pretty good reason why you deviate from it. But we don't have that. So everybody's sort of flying blind here. And that, I think, has to be put together at some point. We obviously don't have it now, but we ought to put it starting now, begin thinking about putting that in place so that the next time we have a COVID-19, we know what we're going to do right off the bat, and we have the resources to do it, or they will be appropriated quickly to do it, because there's a game plan that says funds have to be appropriated for this, and this when this starts. So these stimulus things, which were sort of a scatter shot of assistance, which was okay, but if they were more directed to the critical elements, we'd be in a better position. So I think it's just really good planning, and including the federal government, the governors and the mayors in the process. I get a feeling they didn't talk much to each other for a long time.
And we do have a last question. It's a little bit political. It's asking about President Trump's handling of this. And I think instead of ending on what is probably going to be considered a partisan note, we are a nonpartisan organization. You're giving advice to the leader of any country, okay? Yeah. And not just President Trump. You're giving advice to Angela Merkel in Germany and people all over the world. What's your advice to them?
Yeah, well, I think the procedures we've talked about are the same ones everywhere. Now they have to be adapted. And I have to say one thing about the administration. You got to go back 4 or 5 administrations, none of them prepared for this. So you can't pin it on any particular person or administration. We should have been ready a decade ago for this sort of stuff. People have been predicting it, and we haven't. So, there's really no one to blame other than now we're in it. And from now on, there's no excuse not to have this in place. We saw what a pandemic, we're seeing what a pandemic can do. So now, okay, we got to get it together. And, again, I think we know what to do. And whether it's here or Germany or the UK, maybe we ought to spend a little more time in New Zealand and figure out how they were so successful, adapt some of their things. Each country is having this affect them differently. So we should learn from all of those things and then come up with the right approach.
Great. Ambassador Garvelink, Bill, thank you so much for being with us. It's been very, very interesting and very helpful and constantly changing, of course, right? Yeah. And we're just grateful. We'll probably have you back again because you've mentioned that this is not a problem that's going away. So Well, I know you're keeping tabs on it, and we'll want to keep tabs with you and have another conversation with you. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this. Thanks.
Great. And thank you for joining us. This has been a World Affairs Council of Western Michigan presentation on COVID-19 and a world with pandemics with Ambassador Bill Garvelink. We've appreciated you being with us. Great questions from all of you and from all over the country too. That's terrific. Stay in touch with us at worldmichigan.org. This particular presentation and many of the others we've had this year are archived on our YouTube channel. You go to YouTube and put in World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. They'll direct you to our site and you'll have a wealth of global information for you. And while you're there, please subscribe to our channel. Keep in touch with us and we'll keep in touch with you, and blessings to all of you. Stay safe, stay well.